Guten Tag, es freut mich, dass Sie mich heute hier besuchen können. Mein Name ist Valentine Myers. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Nein? I'm sorry, old habits are hard to break. We're in the United States now, not the Rhine province of Prussia where I was born. I should speak English for you. I was saying, good afternoon. I'm pleased that you could visit with me today. My name is Valentine Myers, but you can call me Val. I realize that none of you would have known me, but you may know some of my great-grandchildren that grew up here in Manier. Trila Darnell is still here. Others that live elsewhere are Carol Appenzeller, Peggy Henderson, and the boys, Larry and Dave, Ed and Steve, and Rick and Rod. I was born in 1833 in the small town of Pfahlsdorf. That's in the very northern part of the country that you now call Germany. My father, Lawrence, was a farmer, but I really don't remember him because he died when I was just a toddler. And that meant life was rough for the 8 of us that were left, my mother, 3 sisters, 3 brothers, and me. So I did farm labor as soon as I was old enough to help out with the family expenses. By the time I was a young adult, I realized the future wasn't looking very good for me. So I decided to join some friends and neighbors that were going to emigrate to America. Now those people will always be my friends, and I guess you could say they're still my neighbors. Maybe you saw some of their headstones as you came through the cemetery. There were Appenzellers, Graffs, Emmicks, Woolenwebbers. We all came here together in 1858 on the steamship Ariel. Being farmers, we headed straight for central Illinois, where we'd heard the farming was as rich as it was in our homeland. I found work right away here in Manier working on William Vaughn's farm, making $12.50 a month. And I saved every penny of that I could because someday I wanted my own farm. Well, after working for Mr. Vaughn for, a little over 3 years, war broke out between the states of the North and the South, and I enlisted in the Union Army. Soldiers were getting $13 a month then, with the first month paid in advance, and we got a $10 signing bonus. I was assigned to Company H of the 115th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, and I held the rank of private throughout the war. Now, my life as a soldier was not a glamorous one. We had a lot of marching drills, and we had a lot of practice with our weapons, but we also had a lot of downtime. Quite frankly, we were bored much of the time. Whenever we had to move long distances, normal supply lines could not keep pace. So in those cases, we had to forage for ourselves to supplement the small amount of food that we always carried with us. Now that meant that we would hunt wild game, and sometimes we would go out and buy or borrow fruit, vegetables, eggs, and livestock from nearby residents. We could only hope that in filling our canteens that we were upstream, if you get my meaning. In September of 1863, our unit and several others marched all day and overnight to a region in the north part of Georgia called Chickamauga Creek. Now this was a very strategic piece of land between Chattanooga, Tennessee and Atlanta, Georgia. Capturing that land would lead to the fall of Chattanooga, which was a major railway supply center for the Southern cause. Up to this point in the war, we had been on several scouting missions, and we'd had a few small skirmishes with the rebels, but this was looking to be our first major fight of the war. Well, when we arrived at the front lines, we were given very little time to rest or get something to eat. Our officers put us behind trees and rocks on one side of a very wide and rolling meadow, and we could see the rebels maneuvering on the far side. Once we were all in place, our artillery opened up to try to soften their lines. Well, of course, their cannons answered with the same tune. Well, after a while, the shelling stopped, and we got the order to attack. We came out from behind those rocks and trees like a single well-oiled machine. We came out running and yelling at the top of our lungs, maybe with a little swearing thrown in, pardon me, ladies. We went after those Rebs and we drove them back. Then they counterattacked and drove us back. And this fighting went on for most of the daylight hours until just before dark. The shooting would stop and wagons would come out from our side and from their side to pick up the soldiers that had fallen during the day. Now this battle went on for the better part of 3 days until our generals decided to abandon the fight. They say this was the last major victory for the Confederacy in the war between the states, but you know, I don't know how anybody could call the Battle of Chickamauga Creek a victory. Well, there were almost 40,000 casualties with the number killed, wounded, and captured. I was one of those casualties. I was wounded and captured on the final day of that battle, and I spent the next 17 months in 5 different Confederate prison camps. One of those was Andersonville in Georgia. Maybe you've heard some of the horror stories of that place. It truly was a hell on earth. That place, that prison camp, was about 20 acres in size. That would be like taking 2 of these cemeteries and blocking them together. It was intended that it would hold about 10,000 prisoners of war, but it often held 30,000. We had no protection there from the rain or the searing heat of the day or the cold winter nights. The only tents we had were those that we brought in with us. Rations were short and usually putrid. Latrines were somewhere between poorly constructed and non-existent. Everything was in such short supply that some of our own men took to robbing fellow prisoners of their food and clothing. Why, I had to have a friend watch after my possessions while I slept, and then I would return the favor to him. After a few months to this exposure to the elements and these living conditions, many of our men were in rags, if they were wearing anything at all. We lost 20 men a day to exposure, dysentery, scurvy, or from wandering into the dead zone. Now, that was an area 18 to 20 feet inside the barricade walls where the guards were permitted to shoot any prisoner venturing there. I'm convinced that some of my fellow prisoners intentionally walked into that zone. They were willing to accept an immediate death rather than continue with their constant misery. While I was being held there at Andersonville, the Union Army's General Sherman began his March to the Sea. Now, that was a battle plan to cut the Confederacy in half and shorten the war. Well, the commanders at our prison camp were concerned that Sherman would come our way, set us prisoners free, and we would be returned to serving in the Union Army. So, those of us that could still walk were moved to a prison camp in Florence, South Carolina. And I'll tell you, conditions there weren't much better than they were at Andersonville. It was at the at the Florence camp that I volunteered to serve as a surgical nurse. I thought this would be a better use of my time than to sit idle all day thinking about how bad our condition was. I became acquainted with another prisoner there from Minonk, Illinois, John January. Now, Mr. January was suffering terribly from malnutrition, and he had gangrene in both feet. Think about the worst odor you've ever encountered. Multiply that tenfold, and you'll have an idea of what it's like to be around someone with rotting flesh caused by gangrene. Well, Mr. January was destined to die unless those infected feet were removed, and removed very soon. I alerted one of the surgeons to his plight, but that doctor said, well, that man's going to die soon anyway, and he refused to operate. Well, another nurse and I felt differently, so we carried Mr. January to a surgical table, and while the other gentleman held Mr. January down, I amputated both of his feet, about 5 inches above each ankle, with a pocket knife. Now, it wasn't all that difficult, really, because I had assisted the surgeon several times on surgeries of this type, and the gangrene had rotted his bones, making my job a little bit easier. Well, so I felt confident that I could perform this operation and close the wounds properly. Well, Mr. January survived that operation, and we both survived the prison camps. We were liberated by Union troops in February of 1865. The war ended 2 months later in April when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Now, with the turmoil that comes from ending a war, compounded with President Lincoln's assassination less than a week later, it took another 3 months before I was finally mustered out of the Army. Well, it was July then by the time I returned to Manier, and by then I had saved enough money to buy my first 80 acres of land at the inflated price of $12 an acre. I hope you folks aren't having to pay that much for farmland now. About a year after I got home from the war, I married Katharina Graff. Now, she had come to America back in '58 with her family on the same ship that I had. But I hadn't paid any attention to her then. Well, at that time, she was an 11-year-old child, and I was a 24-year-old man. But when I came home from the war, she was 18, and well, she'd changed. She changed a lot. Well, eventually we had more than 500 acres to support us and our 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. One of our boys moved to Iowa, and he lies at rest out there. 2 of our boys and 1 of our daughters are lying at rest here in this cemetery, And 2 of our boys and the other daughter are lying at rest at Gaines Cemetery between here and Mackinac. And from their graves, you can see the land that we used to farm. I was one of the founders of the St. John's Church here in town. Back then, we just called it the German Church. I'll bet you can figure out why we called it that. I also had a sense of civic duty, and I served several years as the road commissioner, and I served a few years on the school board also. Now, long after my years of farming and years of public service, I had a really nice surprise. You remember that Mr. January I was telling you about? Well, he came to visit me here in Manier, and by that time, around 1906 I believe it was, he had recovered from his prison weight of 45 pounds to a more robust 200 pounds, and he was wearing prosthetic legs, walking only slightly with a limp. Well, I died the following year, 1907, at the ripe old age of 73. I was ready to go. I'd been ill for a few months. They think I had stomach cancer. So I spend my time out here now next to Katharina. Well, folks, I hope this visit has been as good for you as it was for me. Auf Wiedersehen und viel Glück. Goodbye and good luck.